I was in the wrong hallway on the wrong floor, walking toward what I thought was my father's recovery room after his hip surgery, when I pushed open a door that would end up changing the rest of my life. My name is Sullivan Gray. I'm 34 years old, and up until that Tuesday evening in late January, I would have told you my life was ordinary in every sense of the word. A mortgage, a job in logistics that paid the bills, a father recovering 2 floors below from a routine procedure, and nothing about me that anyone would call remarkable. The hospital was a maze of identical corridors, cream-colored walls, and doors marked with numbers that all blurred together. After my 3rd cup of vending machine coffee, and when I saw the number, 214 on a door and it matched the number, scrawled on the sticky note in my pocket, I walked in without a second thought. The room was dim, lit only by the soft blue glow of a monitor, and the woman lying in the bed was not my father. She was maybe in her late 20s, with pale blonde hair fanned out against the pillow, and machines beside her kept a steady, quiet rhythm that told me she was alive but barely present. I froze in the doorway, already turning to leave and apologize to no one in particular, when something on the wall caught my eye. A small dry erase board that nurses use to jot down patient information, and beside her name, Wilhelmina Hartwell. Someone had written "No visitors on file" in blue marker, and beneath that, in smaller handwriting, 6 months. Something about those 2 lines stopped me cold. 6 months. 6 months alone in a room with no flowers, no cards taped to the walls, no family photographs propped on the windowsill like every other room. I had passed on my way here. Just a woman, a machine, and silence. I don't know what made me stay. Maybe it was guilt. Maybe it was some instinct I didn't have a name for yet. But I found myself sitting down in the plastic chair beside her bed instead of walking back out into the hallway. I told her I was sorry for barging in, spoke to her like she could hear me even, though every part of my logical brain told me she couldn't. I explained. I was looking for my dad's room, that I'd gotten turned around, that I hoped she didn't mind the company for a minute. And then, because the silence in that room felt heavier than any silence I'd ever sat inside of, I did something I hadn't done since I was a kid sitting on my mother's lap. I started to hum. It wasn't even a decision, not really. It was just something my chest wanted to do. An old lullaby my mother used to sing to me before she passed. Something about a boat and a river and a promise to come home. I hummed it low, almost embarrassed at myself, glancing at the door every few seconds in case a nurse walked in and asked what exactly I thought I was doing in a stranger's room. But nobody walked in. And somewhere around the 2nd verse, when I let the humming turn into actual words, half-remembered and clumsy, I noticed something on the monitor beside her bed. The steady green line that measured her heart rate shifted, just slightly. A small flutter that hadn't been there a moment before. I stopped singing immediately, worried I'd done something wrong, worried I'd triggered some alarm I didn't understand. But nothing beeped, nothing flashed red. The line simply settled into a new rhythm, a touch faster than before, as if something inside her had responded to a sound in the room for the first time in a very long while. I sat there staring at that monitor for a full minute, my heart pounding harder than hers probably was, before I convinced myself it was coincidence, a fluke, nothing more than my own imagination trying to make meaning out of a hospital machine. I should have left then. I should have found my father's actual room, apologized to him for taking so long, and never thought about room 214 again. But something kept me rooted to that chair, and before I knew it, I had finished the whole song start to finish, my voice cracking on the last line the way it always did when I thought about my mother. When I finally stood to leave, I glanced back at Wilhelmina one more time, and for a fraction of a second I could have sworn her eyelids fluttered, the way people's do sometimes in a dream. I told myself it meant nothing. I told myself a lot of things that night that turned out to be wrong. The next morning I couldn't stop thinking about her. I told myself it was none of my business, that I had no right showing up in a stranger's hospital room twice. But by the time visiting hours started again, I found myself back on the same floor, standing outside room 214 with a strange kind of nervousness I couldn't explain. A nurse, an older woman with kind eyes and a name tag that read Deborah, caught me lingering by the door and asked if I was family. I told her the truth, that I wasn't, that I'd stumbled in by accident the night before, that something about the woman's story had stayed with me. Deborah studied me for a long moment before she said something I'll never forget. that Wilhelmina had been found, unconscious after a car accident on a rural highway 7 months ago, that the investigation had never turned up any next of kin, that she'd essentially become a ward of the hospital system, cared for by nurses who had grown to love her in their own way but who could never replace a family she didn't seem to have. Deborah told me visitors weren't technically allowed if you weren't listed as family, but she also told me, with a small, tired smile, that nobody had come to check on the woman in half a year, and if I wanted to sit with her for a while. She wasn't going to be the one to stop me, so I did. I came back that evening and the one after that, and before I fully understood what was happening, visiting Wilhelmina had become part of my routine alongside visiting my father, who was healing well and would be discharged within the week. I brought a small speaker one night and played her old records, the kind my mother used to love, and I talked to her about anything and everything. My job, my childhood, the ache of losing my mom, the strange, quiet loneliness that had crept into my own life without me noticing until I met a woman who had no one at all. I never expected her to answer. I never expected anything, really, except the strange comfort of being useful to someone in a way that had nothing to do with money or convenience. 3 weeks after that first night, I was sitting beside her bed, reading aloud from a battered paperback I'd found in the hospital gift shop, my voice filling the quiet room the way it had become accustomed to doing, when I heard something that made my entire body go still, a small sound barely audible, somewhere between a breath and a word. I looked up from the book to find her eyes open, just barely, unfocused and glassy, but open. I dropped the book and pressed the call button so hard I nearly broke it, shouting for a nurse, my hand shaking as I leaned closer and told her she was safe, that she was in a hospital, that everything was going to be okay, even though I had absolutely no idea if that was true. The next several hours were a blur of doctors and specialists and hushed, urgent conversations in the hallway, but by the time the sun rose the next morning, Wilhelmina Hartwell was awake, truly awake, blinking at the ceiling, confused and frightened in the way anyone would be after losing 7 months of their life to silence. The doctors told me later that cases like hers were rare but not unheard of, that some coma patients respond to consistent auditory stimulation, familiar voices, repeated presence, even when no family member is available to provide it. They couldn't promise that my visits were the reason she woke up. But they also couldn't rule it out, and honestly, neither of us cared much about the science of it once we were finally able to sit across from each other and actually talk. Hello, dear friends. Today let's make a chocolate cake. First, prepare flour, cocoa powder, baking powder, salt, eggs, butter, and other ingredients. Mix them together and knead them into a fine dough. Next, let the dough rise until it becomes fluffy and soft. Then, scoop the cake batter into a baking pan and add the pre-made stuff. Finally, when the sweet cake comes out of the oven, exuding its tempting aroma, everyone gathers around to enjoy it together. The joy in their hearts is hard to express in words. Come and try making your own chocolate cake.